مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لو سئل الناس عن السياسة في الولايات المتحدة سيقول معظمهم إنها موازنة بين الديمقراطيين والجمهوريين، وسيقول البعض إنها منقسمة بين الليبراليين والمحافظين، وقد يقول آخرون إن الأعراق والأديان والاقتصاد هي العوامل الأهم في السياسة الأمريكية. كلهم مخطئون. فما هو العامل الأكثر تأثيرا في التصويت الانتخابي في أمريكا؟ الإجابة بسيطة: الأشخاص الذين ينتخبون والأشخاص الذين لا ينتخبون. وكما شرحت صحيفة نيويورك تايمز في مقال حديث، فإن من يكرر نتائج الانتخابات الوطنية هم الأشخاص غير المشاركين في التصويت. من هم الناخبون في سباق الانتخابات الرئاسية؟ ومن هم الذين على الأرجح لن يقوموا بعملية التصويت؟ وهل تغيرت الإحصائيات مع الوقت؟ وكيف ستتمكن الأحزاب من تغيير خارطة الطريق لمساعدة مرشحيها في تحقيق نتائج أفضل؟ لمناقشة موضوع مشاركة الناخبين في عملياتنا الديمقراطية وتأثير ذلك على انتخابات 2024، يسرني أن أستضيف نخبة من الخبراء السياسيين: تود جيلمان، أنجيلا غرايلينغ كين، وبيل كريستل. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Elections are about votes, and votes only matter depending on who shows up to cast a ballot. Today we're going to talk about voting in America and what each of the political parties needs to do to maximize their share of the people who turn out to vote. I'm delighted to welcome Tod Gilman and Bill Kristol to help explain voting in America to our audience abroad. Gentlemen, in 2020, our last presidential election, 2/3 of eligible voters turned out to vote. That was the highest percentage in 120 years. But 66% is a failing grade in school. Why is that so low? Todd?
Well, it was so high because we were in the middle of the pandemic and a lot of states made it a lot easier to vote from home or from your car by turning in a paper ballot instead of having to wait for a half an hour or even a couple of hours at a physical polling site at your local school or fire department. People tend to be apathetic except when they're very, very exercised and worked up about something. A lot of people were worked up about Donald Trump, pro and con, in 2020 and will be again this year. I think that we can expect to see a fairly robust turnout by a lot of voters who want to vote against the other guy. Not so much enthusiasm for Biden or for Trump, although there's certainly a level of enthusiasm on each side for each of those nominees. But the level of emotion against the other guy is just enormous, and we see that in poll after poll. And in addition to a general sense of we sure wish that it wasn't a rematch between these two guys.
So, Bill, 66%, 2 out of 3 showing up. Is this high or is this low in your view?
I mean, it certainly was a big increase in turnout by American standards, and it had been down as low as 50% just 20 years before. So Donald Trump and the pandemic, I guess, energized people. As Howard said, Saad said, the pandemic made it easier, ironically, for people to vote by mail, and states instituted reforms, some of which still exist, making mail voting, for example, much easier. And then also there was enthusiasm and counter-enthusiasm on both sides. So a big turnout. There was a big turnout in 2018 and 2022 in the congressional elections too. So the Trump era has been marked by a big surge of turnout. Generally, America's always had lower turnout. We don't have mandatory voting, unlike many countries. We're a federalist system. It's slightly complicated to register if you move from one state to another, which it's not that complicated, but it does require doing it, which is not the case in most nations, which have national sort of registration. Once you're registered, you don't have to re-register when you move. And most states have national elections where you just vote for a slate of candidates or one president, popular vote. Here, as we all know, it's a federal system. So all of that, I think, contributes to less turnout here. One, Seymour Martin Lipset, a very famous social scientist, argued, 50 years ago, I think, and others have too, that maybe turnout here being lower was a sign of political health in a way, that people were reasonably satisfied. They weren't super alarmed by the choices. The two parties used to not differ that much. And you could tell yourself, we don't have election day as a holiday here. That's another legal difference from a lot of states, a lot of nations. And so you could tell yourself, I'm not going to leave work early, or I'm not going to get up super early at 6 a.m. to get there before work. It's on a Tuesday. It's not on a weekend. It's funny. I mean, when you think about it for a minute, though, and I'm sure people have studied this much more than I know, than the reading I've done. We've never really prioritized Election Day as a national thing to make it easier for people to vote. I mean, again, holidays, mandatory voting, there are lots of things other nations do that we don't do. Maybe that's kind of part of our complacency, that we're a functioning democracy. We don't need to go out of our way. We also have more elections, finally, than most nations, because we have local elections, state elections, national elections. And so it's not, many places it's kind of once every 4 years or something you show up to vote. So it's a different system. It's worked pretty well for most of our history, on the other hand. And people haven't complained about it too much, obviously race being an exception there. But now it's more fraught because the country's so polarized. The elections have been so close. Voting registration issues have become major political issues, whether it's easier or harder to vote, and so forth.
So actually, I checked the statistics, and I saw a study that showed 108 countries had higher percentages in their most recent national elections. So compared to global trends, we're pretty far down the list. Is that surprising to you at all?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Bill made a lot of the points about why there might be complacency. I would use something like Russia as a benchmark of, oh gosh, they have 87% turnout for Putin, and why doesn't America care so much about its presidential elections? Because that is not exactly a paragon of democracy. So I think that people sometimes vote or cast or express themselves by not voting. It is a way that many Americans choose to say, I am not enthusiastic about that guy. It's not just that I'm apathetic. It's not just that I see no difference between Trump and Biden, which you'd have to be fairly blind not to see a difference between Trump and Biden, but to express that I don't really like either of them. There's only one real way of doing that. I would also make the point, in addition to all the really good points that Bill made about the structure and the mechanisms by which Americans vote, is that in a presidential election, it's, with two very, very small exceptions, winner take all by state. And there's an enormous amount of polarization state by state, so that a state like Texas is predominantly Republican, and a state like California or New York is predominantly Democratic. And it's pretty easy to tell yourself whether you're a Democrat or a Republican in any of those states, that your individual vote just doesn't matter that much, because you know how the vote statewide is going to go, and all of those electoral votes are going to go to the one guy. So it's really only in a very small number of toss-up states where it's very possible to look in the mirror and say, oh gosh, if only I had voted, I could have made a difference, because this was decided by 10,000 ballots. So, the state, Michigan, I'm sure I'm going to miss one, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, there just aren't that many battleground states where the candidates, the campaigns invest disproportionate resources to try to drive up turnout.
Delighted to welcome Angela Greiling-Keane to our show. You're on with two veterans, so just jump on in whenever you feel like it, Angela. Delighted to have you. Let's take a look, if we can, at some of the demographics of people who don't vote. Because you would think, one might think, they're a basket of potential voters for whichever candidate can tap this group: age, race, gender, economic status. Do you have any insight at describing who it is doesn't tend to vote in America?
I can jump in on that. Certainly, it's the same people it's been for many, many decades. Not the same people, because the young people who don't vote, of course, become older people who are more likely to vote. But it's always the younger people, the lower income people, minorities, most underrepresented groups tend to be the demographics that don't vote. Illinois overall had very poor turnout, to the point where the Board of Elections was commenting publicly on it. But we especially saw low turnout in Chicago. It was only about 20% of eligible voters. And of course, 20% of eligible voters is not 20% of the overall population. So it's even less than what it might appear at first glance. But the groups that tend not to vote, it's a perpetual problem. There's lots of groups that work on particularly getting younger voters to turn out. There's lots of efforts in lower income communities to make sure that people have rides to voting places, that they can get there, they can get enough time off of work. But it remains a stagnant demographic that does not vote in the United States.
Yeah, Bill, I read a fascinating statistic in a major New York Times story that looked at intermittent voters who will vote in one election and not another election, and they just vote periodically. And it was looking at the last three presidential elections, intermittent voters tilted Republican. Which seemed a little surprising to me. Would that be surprising to you?
I mean, no, because Donald Trump turned out a lot of lower propensity voters who decided they liked Trump and they wanted to shake things up. A lot of them rural voters. And so that's changed historically. Democrats have always assumed, the Democratic Party has always assumed with some reason, that if they could turn out more voters in total, it would help them, because younger voters tend to be more liberal, more democratic. A lot of the minority groups who vote a little less than others tend also to be democratic. Older voters, as they age, tend to, maybe they always were a little more Republican. Their cohort might have been more Republican if they came of age during Reagan or something like that, but also they tend to get a little more conservative as they get older, and for obvious kind of reasons. So yeah, but that's changed, and it's a very interesting question actually for strategists in both parties, whether higher turnout, both at the presidential level and some of these other levels, state, governor, congressional, now is sort of helps Republicans or helps Democrats. It really depends on who those low propensity voters are. Just I'd add one more point, though, that I think just to defend the American voters a little bit here, to Todd's point about the state, we have an electoral college system. So in many states, you can tell yourself it's not going to matter much if you vote statewide. Many of the states are polarized, so it may not matter much in your governor's race or your Senate race if you vote. I mean, they become much more lopsided, much more polarized than they used to be. It used to be many states had a Republican. When I got to Washington, more states than not had one Republican and one Democratic senator. So by definition, a Democrat or a Republican could win those states. So by definition, it might be worth voting in those states. What's actually amazing is that now it's 45 states have senators, 2 senators from one party. So you could tell yourself not to vote. It's sort of amazing that we have had this big surge in turnout the last 10 years or so. But also congressional districts have become so much more sorted out sociologically and economically and dominated by one party or another. Then there's some gerrymandering too that helps with that or hurts that. So in fact, some voters are being pretty reasonable, honestly, when they say, I'm looking at the presidential race, the electoral college, I'm looking at the Senate or governor's race in my state, I'm looking at the congressional race in my state. Do I really need to vote? Especially, as I say, if it's not a holiday, you're working, especially if you're a lower income, you're probably at a job where you don't have the discretion that an upper middle class person might have. I'm just going to show up an hour late to the office today. Well, not if you're working as a nurse at a hospital on a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift. And so we don't make it that easy for those people to vote. And they can also correctly, say fairly to them, that it probably wouldn't make that much difference if I voted in my own particular area. So it's not a system that is designed, a lot of good things about the American system, but I wouldn't say it's designed to maximize overall turnout.
All right. When we come back after the break, I'm going to ask my panelists to put themselves into the mind of a chief political operative for one of the presidential candidates and imagine what their strategy would be to try to get out the biggest vote possible for their candidate. We'll talk about this after the break. Again, my guests today include Todd Gilman. Todd recently ended his 30-plus year run as reporter and Washington bureau chief for the Dallas Morning News. Also with us is Bill Kristol. Bill is editor-at-large of The Bulwark, one of Washington's leading traditional conservatives. He was the founder and editor-at-large of the venerable Weekly Standard. And joining us for the first time, I want to welcome Angela Greiling-Keene. She is news director at Bloomberg Government. All right, let's think like political operatives working for a presidential candidate. If your priority is securing the base, what would you do to try to maximize the vote? Angela?
Well, I'm going to take that question and go a slightly different direction, and that is one party doing things to affect the vote of the other party. In the Ohio Senate primary, the most conservative candidate won, and he was supported by Donald Trump. He also was supported in the primary by Democrats. So that was absolutely part of what the strategists for the Democratic Party were looking at when they were looking at turning out the people that they wanted for that race, because they wanted the most conservative candidate to win, to give their candidate, incumbent Senator Sherrod Brown, the best chance of winning. So it's an interesting part of the strategy, but I think that sort of, backdoor, who do you want to turn out, who do you not want to turn out, is going to be a big part of how political strategists think about this year and who they want to get out and who they don't want to show up.
All right, so that will be a strategy for affecting who's on the ballot. Bill, if you wanted to secure the base of your party, maximize your loyalists, what would you do? And would that have an impact on say, trying to appeal to other potential candidates like undecideds?
Yeah, good. The parties are in a somewhat different situation, I'd say, tactically and strategically, structurally almost. Donald Trump can turn out most of his voters by being Donald Trump, honestly, and they're mostly older, and many of them are ex-urban and rural, and those places have high turnout anyway. So he probably, they're obviously still, they're going to do the mechanics of texting and calling and mailing and helping these voters get to the polls, but I think they have a more natural, Trump at this point, the Republicans have a more natural turnout, as it were, on election day. Democrats do depend on, or Democratic victory will probably depend on a decent turnout, not as high as with older people, but a decent turnout of younger voters in particular. And they're just harder to get to vote. They're for kind of obvious reasons. They're also very mobile, and they don't live in one place for very long, and they forget to register. And most states don't yet have instant or automatic voter registration. They go to college. They're not sure whether they should vote in their college town or where they grew up with their parents if they're 20 years old and so forth. So it's just harder to get young voters to vote. Democrats and liberal groups have spent a lot of time and money and effort on this over the last decade, or really more than that, with some success, especially in swing states. And there are huge college towns in some of these swing states, Madison, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Michigan, which have wildly lopsided results, which will be for Biden and against Trump, assuming they're the nominees. So that's a really different task in a way, though, than the Republican task. The Republican task is a little more of a messaging task, I would say. The Democratic task really is getting a lot of people on the ground in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and registering all those students and reminding them after they've been out late the night before and are staggering to class at 11 a.m. that they need to vote and stop, after class. And they just need a lot more on-the-ground presence, I would say, the Democrats do than the Republicans.
And Todd, the basic question of registering to vote has become so political in our country as well. It's usually associated with liberals and progressives, but shouldn't conservatives also want to make sure that a lot of non-college educated working class people get?
But they should, and it's an interesting phenomenon we've seen over the years, where traditionally in as we've described, Bill particularly has described during this conversation, that elections are controlled and executed at the local and state level. State legislatures set these rules, and for the most part, efforts to make it easier to vote are in states where the legislatures are controlled by Democrats, and efforts to make it harder to register and vote are in states that don't. So, for instance, in Texas, there was a law enacted a few years ago that if you had a permit to carry a concealed gun, you could use that to prove who you were so that you could cast a ballot. But if you had a student ID from a Texas university, which is also a government-issued identification card, that wouldn't be good enough. So, to your point, there's no question that these rules, these restrictions cut both ways. It's one of the reasons that we've seen Laura Trump, who is Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, who was just installed as the number 2 person at the Republican Party committee, saying we need to embrace mail-in voting. This is a way to make it convenient for our people to vote as well, which is contradictory to former President Trump's messaging about mail-in ballots are rife with fraud. On the messaging point, if I could just bring us back for 1 second to the messaging point, because I'm not sure that we hit it hard enough. The way these strategists are getting their voters out is pretty obvious. Trump is just saying border security, border security, border security, immigration, over and over and over. We've seen incredible numbers of people coming across the southern border from Mexico in the past couple of years, record numbers. It's not a record at the moment, but it has peaked at record levels under Biden. And this is something that works very well on a policy and a really visceral level with conservative voters and Republican voters, including a lot of Republican voters who might otherwise be wary of Trump, but are especially wary of Biden. And Biden is doing a few things to motivate, for instance, younger voters. He has forgiven college debt, which is like giving candy to people and enticing them to support him. But he's also hammering over and over what a threat Trump is to American democracy, and all the ways that he riled up people ahead of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, and has even teased the idea that he would be a dictator, at least for one day, if reelected. So, we see very, very different. They're not arguing on the same issues like, oh, let's talk about tax policy. Here's my view. Here's my view. They're really talking past each other on issues that are bound to very much gin up support on their side.
Terrific. Very good. Thank you very much. Angela Greiling-Keane, Bill Kristol, Todd Gilman. Thank you for joining me this week on Dakhel Washington. وصلنا إلى ختام حلقتنا من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات على هذه الحلقة، وخاصة بما يتعلق بتأثير الأحزاب الصغيرة على نتائج الانتخابات الرئاسية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي على تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة @Rob Satloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك حين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.